Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Thursday, the 16th of October, 2025. Very interesting piece in this week's New York Times. Big feature, guest essay with lots of interesting art on how to save the American experiment, apparently according to its author, my guest today, John Fabian Witt. America is in crisis. Democracy in the United States is spiraling into a widening gyre of distrust, demagoguery, and violence. So the question is how to save it. He has a new book out this week, The Radical Fund, How a Band of Visionaries and $1 Million Upended America. It teaches at Yale University, and he's joining us, appropriately enough, from New Haven, where Yale is based. John, congratulations on the new book. I'm not sure if you came up with that title, How to Save the American Experiment, but what exactly in your mind is the American experiment?
Well, not my title, but I kind of like it. It's a project to create a modern democracy. I mean, that's how do we live together? How do we live together across wild diversities, wild differences? How do we unleash our energies and without killing one another? That's the project, right?
You're the expert, John. And how much of a crisis are we in? How much is what your editor at the New York Times calls the American experiment? How much of it is jeopardized?
Well, the amount of distrust in our politics right now is really destructive. I mean, I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying anything exceptional when I say that. The thing that I want to add to the conversation, Andrew, is the idea that we've been here before in the modern world. Modern democracies have encountered moments of radical distrust before, including in the United States. And I think if we go back to a century ago in the 1920s, we can see some really astonishing parallels. And that's what the Times piece was about. And that comes out in the book too.
Well, you would say that, John. You're a historian. We've been there before. And of course, your new book, which is already getting rave reviews, The Radical Fund, How a Band of Visionaries and $1 Million Upended America, is about being there before. Before we get to the Radical Fund itself, let's go back to the 20s. What's your interpretation? Are the 1920s rather like the 2020s?
Well, let's think of a country coming off a pandemic, a world coming off a pandemic, a world in which capitalism has produced massive new economic inequalities, a world in which immigration is being shut down in the United States and around the world. I mean, the parallels kind of astonishing when you think about it that way. We've got surging Christian nationalism. The 1920s had the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, the parallels just keep going on and on. New information technologies coming on board, changing the way in which we learn about the world around us. I mean, a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's almost uncannily similar, although when one thinks of, I don't know, the Scopes trial in the 20s, we did a show about that a couple of months ago. The political implications or the political map of something like the Scopes trial seems rather different from the 2020s, but maybe we'll come to that later. Are there any profound differences before we get to the Radical Fund, John, and how, in your view at least, it offers some hope for the 2020s? Are there any profound differences between the 1920s and the 2020s? You're a historian, so that you know better than anyone that history never quite repeats itself. Maybe it rhymes, as one famous American once observed.
Well, for sure, huge differences. Let's take two. the mass industrial capitalism of the 1920s doesn't look like the capitalism of the 2020s. Like gig work, virtual work, the rise of AI, the kinds of things that are reshaping technologies of capitalism in the 2020s are new to our moment. The thing they share in common, I'll get to a second difference in a minute, but the thing they share in common is we're in moments of flux. So the rise of the second industrial revolution of the modern mass consumer economy was a moment of real flux and dislocation. We're in a similar moment of flux and dislocation. Second big difference, I'd say, is politics. In the United States, there isn't a national political figure who in the 1920s can figure as a demagogue able to take advantage of new communications technologies. There are state level characters. I'm thinking of Huey Long, for example, Louisiana or something. But the existence of a national political channel. I mean, FDR is going to begin that with his fireside chats, but in the 20s that doesn't really exist, and so that's different for sure.
If John Fabian Witt, who teaches at Yale, if he was around in the 1920s, there were, of course, equivalents of Witt in the 20s, historians at Yale and all the leading universities. Had I asked this equivalent of Witt back in the 20s, what are the historical comparisons? Where can we look in history to understand this crisis of America in the 1920s? Where would historians look? Would they have looked to the Civil War, to the founding of the Republic, to the first Industrial Revolution?
Well, maybe the couple decades before the Civil War, that you've got a moment of huge economic growth, the Industrial Revolution takeoff for the United States, vast growth, the Erie Canal and the railroads that follow, producing huge growth, but at the same time, a huge culture clash arising in North and South, and the controversy over slavery and abolition. So I think I might look to that moment. The thing I like about the 20s, which we can see from our perspective in a way that my predecessor a century ago couldn't have, is we figured out a way through without a civil war that killed 700,000 Americans. That's the idea. Is what are the lessons we can draw from the 1920s that managed to see this democracy anyway through?
Were there historians in the 20s, John, who compared the strife, the potential, well, although in the 20s, of course, we're talking mostly before the Great Crash, but were there historians in the 20s who compared the divisions in America to the divisions in America before the Civil War?
Oh, for sure. I mean, let's think of maybe one of the most controversial but also famous historians of that era is Charles Beard, long historian at Columbia University, and Beard takes an account of American history that's about class conflict from the founding. I mean, his most famous book is about the Constitution's creation in the 1780s. But that class conflict-oriented view was one that he's drawing from his world of the 1910s and 20s.
John, you're certainly not the first or the last historian or thinker to make the comparison between the 2020s and the 1920s. What you've done, though, is focus on this, what you call this radical fund, one of the first, if not the first, non-profit group focused on progressive issues to begin in the 20s. Why did you choose to write about the Radical Fund? And I assume that it's built around your concern with the dodgy state currently of the American experiment.
It started, a long time ago. I started this book nearly a decade and a half ago. I had to piece it together from archives around the country. And it started because in my field, in the history of American law, Brown against Board of Education, its history, its current crisis, is a huge question. And this foundation helped to finance the beginnings of the Brown against Board of Education case, ruling segregation in American schools unconstitutional. And that's the beginning. And then what I learned was that they did so much more. That was just a small piece of their project. That's how I got in, and it kind of it spiraled from there.
It's very much of an American narrative. One can indeed even imagine your book being turned into a Hollywood movie. I'm sure the movie rights haven't been snapped up. They will be. Tell me about this character, James Albert No, his father was James Albert Garland. Your hero in the book, Charles Garland. Who was he, and why is he important?
Yeah, he's a curious character. He finds himself a kind of disillusioned, troubled Harvard undergraduate in 1920, turns 21 years old, and inherits $1 million made by his grandfather. His father's a playboy spendthrift who nearly loses the whole fortune, but inherits the what's left of his grandfather's estate in 1920 and refuses it. Andrew, he says, I don't deserve this. I didn't earn this. Inheritance is unjust. It shouldn't exist in the world. I don't want to participate in a world of such outrageous inequality. And he says no. And this produces a huge to-do. The society pages from the papers in Boston and New York and Los Angeles descend on his farm in Cape Cod to ask him why he said no. And it produces one of the scandals of the era.
He's a man of the left. I mean, I'm not comparing Garland to Luigi Mangione, another scion of the American elite who chose a different response to what he sees as injustice. But was Garland's generation, these wealthy sons and daughters of American industrialists, were they particularly prone, vulnerable to revolutionary theories, either from the left or the right?
This foundation is part of the pivot of American progressive and left politics away from violence. I mean, if you think from the Haymarket Massacre in the 1880s, for a couple decades thereafter, through anarchist bombings and the industrial workers of the world in the 1910s, there's a huge amount of labor-oriented political violence in the United States. And in the 1920s, at the same time as this foundation, there's a pivot. And the people this fund finances are the early nonviolent practitioners of nonviolent protest. People like A.J. Muste, who helps to inspire a whole generation of civil rights activists in a later moment. So this is about that pivot. And Garland himself has that nonviolent commitment. He does become vulnerable to some Communist Party inspired intrigue later in his life, but in this period, it's really about that shift to nonviolence.
So tell me about this man, Garland. He was an American patriot. What had I had the opportunity to interview him, what would he have told me about the American experiment?
He'd tell you that it was deeply troubled. You know, here he is. He's a young man. He's not a man of any great special wisdom and experience when he inherits this money, and that's part of his point. He drops out of the fund's story. He gives the money to a couple people who are super energetic, brilliant interpreters of the American experience. Then he goes off and tries to form a set of utopian communes, first in Massachusetts, then in Pennsylvania, which are efforts to create models for how people might live together. He calls them April Farm, after the name of the first one in Massachusetts. And they are efforts to create worlds without private property, without marriage. He is opposed to the practice of monogamous marriage. There's all sorts of worries by communities around him that his utopian farms are going to turn into free love communes. And the society papers find this guy fascinating for a decade and more.
So the 60s came in the 1920s, and it's an interesting narrative. I'm sure, as you say, it attracted journalists intrigued by the scandal of free love in the 1920s. And here was a guy who inherited a lot of money and felt maybe guilty about it or wasn't quite sure what to do with it. So he gave it to a foundation. But so what, John? I mean, this has happened many times in history. What's the big deal about Garland and his radical fund?
So the big deal is who gets it. And the two guys who create it are Upton Sinclair, famous muckraker, novelist, writer of a book called The Jungle that I know you know and most of your listeners will know. This is the great pulling off of the blanket of silence around the slaughter yards of Chicago and the terrible labor abuses there. and also a guy named Roger Baldwin, who really takes the lead on the foundation for the next 20 years. And Baldwin has just founded the American Civil Liberties Union. And the ACLU is about protecting people's rights. And what we haven't understood about the history of the ACLU is that right alongside it is an affirmative, positive project, not about protecting people's rights, but about changing the world positively by creating new programs. And that's the Garland Fund. And Baldwin runs the two for 20 years right alongside one another.
There's never been a lack of capital for these sorts of things. I mean, especially in the 1920s or 2020s during times of boom. So are you suggesting that the remarkable thing, John, about what you call the Radical Fund, Garland's fund, was that he was smart enough or lucky enough to find responsible adults to invest the money appropriately rather than frittering it away?
There's a lot of luck in this. I mean, I'm always interested in contingency and history and accidents, and it's an accident of sorts that the money ends up with Baldwin, who's so well connected in progressive New York City. The thing about the 20s is that the great foundations are getting underway. You know, the world that we can recognize today is starting with Rockefeller, Carnegie, a whole bunch of big foundations on the scene, but none of them will have anything to do with the ACLU or the NAACP or the labor unions that spin out of those worlds. All those are anathema to Rockefeller and Carnegie. And so this little foundation, it's the only shop in town. It's a one-stop shop for those kinds of groups and forces them to come together in new ways.
Why was the NCAAP or the ACLU, why were they, and I'm borrowing your word, such an anathema to a Carnegie or a Rockefeller? I mean, they weren't communists. They were simply trying to address issues of political freedom or racial injustice. What was the problem with them?
Yeah, well, the ACLU is strongly the view that capital needs to be redistributed in the 1920s. That's the root of political and economic repression. That free speech actually requires something like social equality, or at least more equality than the 1920s had. I mean, Andrew, you've probably seen the great graphs, the U-shaped curves of equality and economic inequality, 1920 to the present. Huge economic inequality a century ago, reduced in the period in which labor unions managed to do some redistribution in the middle of the 20th century, and then right back up. So we're back again where they were in the 1920s. And honestly, Carnegie and Rockefeller, they're not interested in that. That's not their project.
Interesting. And I mean, one of the ironies, I guess, John, again, you're all too familiar, is you're talking about a private philanthropic group funded by the money of a young idealist, Charles Garland. But would it be fair to say that the real restructuring of America took place through government, through the New Deal, and indeed through the Great Crash? You never would have had FDR without what happened economically at the end of the 1920s. So by focusing on this fund, this philanthropic initiative by a wealthy young guy, you're actually ignoring the heart of the issue.
Yeah, I thought a lot about this in formulating this project and deciding to spend so much time with these people. And I guess here's one of the ways I started to think about it. I'd love to know what you think about this, Andrew. The thought is that big forces, it takes big forces to change the world. The Great Migration of 6 million Black people from the South to the North, the crash of 1929, the onset of World War II. These are the huge forces, the geopolitical configuration of the Cold War, right? We know, and your viewers know, that those are the things that they provide the energy for big change. But big change, the direction of big change, the shape of big change isn't determined by those forces. That is, there is space for human agency, for social movements to alter the way in which the future comes about. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to see the experiments by these progressives in exile in the 1920s who put in place new institutions, new social forms that then could take on the energy produced by those big things. And so we look at what Roosevelt does. Roosevelt is relying on the brain trust of people from the 20s who are thinking through how to recreate capitalism. And Roosevelt is borrowing from the world of the fund. You know, the last part of the book is watching these outsiders become insiders, and watching them bring the experiments they started in the 20s into the New Deal administration.
It's interesting, in your wonderful New York Times piece, you talk in the 20s about many Americans abandoning politics, surrendering to the jazz age celebrity of F. Scott Fitzgerald and so on. Do you see a similar thing happening today, that people are giving up on politics?
Well, for sure. I mean, the politics is such an ugly business right now. It's so full of lies and strategies, and it's just an ugly place. One has the sense that good people don't want to go into it, and that my neighbors don't want to talk about it. And people are looking for ways to find meaning in their private pursuits, and I totally get that. Family, the arts, theater, movies, and all these things. You can see it in book selling, this business that I've just now entered with the publication of this book. But fiction sales are up, nonfiction sales are down. People don't want to deal with it.
The Garland Fund brought together a remarkable group of people. You write about W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, Walter Lippmann, many others, the founders of important philanthropic groups, like the ACLU. Was there a politics within the Radical Front? How did they negotiate political divisions between a Du Bois, a Lippmann, people on the left, in the center, technocrats, idealists? I assume they didn't agree on everything.
No, there's a huge amount of fighting in the foundation. I mean, I've told you that it was the one place to go, so everybody goes there, and then they have it out. And in the early days, when there's enough money to go around, the fights are relatively diminished. But then as it becomes clear that the money's gonna come to an end one day, the knives come out. There are any number of divides. There's a divide between folks who want to invest in labor and folks who want to invest in Black organizations like the NAACP. That divide comes up in the middle of the 20s. And then at the end of the 20s, the Communist Party tries to infiltrate the fund and take it over, and wrest its remaining resources for its own front groups. And that provides a really crucial fight in the run-up to what eventually will become Brown against Board of Education.
Could you be a little more concrete about this transition between a private fund and the FDR experiment, and then Brown versus Board? I mean, there are obviously a lot of individuals associated. Are these connections anecdotal, haphazard, accidental, or is there a clear line between what you call the Radical Fund and 20th century progressive American history?
Yeah, I think this foundation is an incubator for the kinds of things that come later. It's not sufficient to bring those things about, for sure. That it might be that we need calamity. That calamities need to happen.
We need calamity. That's a headline.
There you go. Calamity scrambles things and allows for new possibilities to emerge. But this incubator put in place new forms that could take root. I mean, just some examples. The industrial union, not a union organized around trades like carpenters, bricklayers, machinists, and the like, but organized around entire industries. That's something that in the 1920s, a core group of people around this fund helped to foster, helped to grow, such that once labor unions could have a foothold in the middle of the Great Depression, the industrial union was ready to go. And the brain trust of this fund, flows into the National Labor Relations Board and other key New Deal agencies.
You're a historian, John, so you're all too familiar with teleological narratives. But I wonder, I mean, we did a show, we've done many shows on this period. One comes to mind with Adam Hochschild, the author of American Midnight, the period just after the First World War that created the conditions for the 1920s. Are you arguing in this book that had, I don't know, Charles Garland not had his epiphany, or had he met a woman and got a job on Wall Street, or got run over by a car or something, that the whole history of America would have been different in the 20th century?
Well, the movements that he's financing, exist independent of the fund. The NAACP is formed in 1909. The ACLU formed in 1920, 2 years before this fund gets incorporated and is up and running. And what the fund does is give a little more energy, just that much more energy to those core organizations, those social movements of the 1920s. The thing it also does is bring them into conversation with one another. It brings labor unions into conversation with Black organizations. And that's a famous divide in American history before the 20s. The labor unions in the United States are almost all white. And the fund helps to produce the labor unions of A. Philip Randolph, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So the contribution is in creating and convening a conversation. And I don't want to understate the importance of that. I mean, that conversation about cross-race participation in a labor movement, that's crucial to the success, such as it was, of the American labor movement.
Is the book, is it designed to also inspire conservatives? I mean, it's about the radical front. You wear your politics on your sleeve. It's clearly a progressive manifesto, as Garland's organization was dedicated towards. But conservative nonprofits have also been enormously influential. Indeed, the reaction, it seems, against FDR's New Deal in the 60s, Phyllis Schlafly, the Heritage Fund, and so on and so forth, they could have almost read your radical fund before it was written.
Well, and they did. I mean, the Volcker Fund in the 1940s and 50s, which is really in some ways the beginning of the civil society, philanthropically financed critique of the New Deal regime. The Volcker Fund folks are replicating the successes of progressives in the 1920s and 30s and incubating a critique of the regime that in which they find themselves. You know, philanthropic foundations in the United States have the role of agenda setters. They are triggers for change. They spark change. They can't drive it through, but they can set agendas for politics, and that can happen on the left or the right. And for the last couple generations, it's been much more successful on the right. And honestly, there are ways in which the right today in the 2020s has more successfully conceived of configurations of society and politics to match the economic crisis of our late capitalism moment.
So how should progressives read this book? There's no, as I said earlier, there's no lack of capital, John, for investing in progressive movements. Many progressive billionaires still in Silicon Valley. Reid Hoffman comes to mind. The widow of Steve Jobs has invested massively in media. What's the message for progressives in the 2020s of the radical front? Obviously, you're suggesting they should put some of their wealth into making America a better place, but that's self-evident. You don't need to write a book about that. How would you like the equivalent of a Charles Garland, maybe the son or daughter of Larry Ellison or Steve Jobs or one of the Google multi-billionaires? How would you like them to read this book?
Well, one of the lessons is that it's not sheer volume of dollars. I mean, Garland's inheritance is $1 million denominated in $1920. If he makes another $1 million on the stock market of the 1920s, mostly it's in a First National Bank of New York shares. It's a predecessor to the Citigroup empire of today. So let's double that. It's $2 million, still a fraction of what Rockefeller and Carnegie are doing. You index for inflation, we're talking about $40 million in the 2020s. I mean, this is tiny as compared to the giant fortunes of today. If you scale it to the size of the 2020s economy, you could describe it as roughly $800 million. That might be the equivalent amount. Even then, Andrew, small as compared to the amounts that we're talking about with the great financiers of our time. So amounts are not the key. What this group did, because it was the only game in town for left organizations of the 1920s, is it produced conversations among people who disagreed with one another about the core issues of organizing a better politics of their time. And those conversations, well, they were transformative. I mean, will conversations be transformative today? Who can know? Who can know? There were all sorts of failed efforts in the 20s, as there are always failed efforts. But having a conversation with the most important social movements of the day, ones that are fighting with one another for resources, ones that are at odds with one another, see the world differently, and putting them in the same room, that made some magic.
Are there similar conversations in the 20s? I mean, obviously you have Mandami in New York, you have the conversation that's been triggered by the Klein-Thompson book on abundance. Do you see the beginnings of similar conversations on the left in 2025?
Yeah, for sure. The political exile of folks on the left is producing a new set of experiments and efforts to figure out how to reorganize large numbers of people, to connect them in meaningful ways to their politics. You see it also in efforts to manage the information space, a radically changed information environment that we've been in the last generation. That's another thing that Americans were struggling with in the 1920s. So
Lippmann, of course, was central in observing that, right? We did a biography of Lippmann a few months ago.
Right, the new biography of Lippmann is just a great introduction for readers who want to see Lippmann for the 2020s. I'm glad you got to focus on that. So I think there are all sorts of experiments going on right now that are efforts to think through. Now, how successful have they been? I don't know. Are labor unions the way to connect people in the 2020s capitalism as they were in the 1920s capitalism? It's hard to say. And unions are trying to reorganize themselves to map the world, to match the world that we find ourselves in.
Do we need to think differently? I mean, that was, of course, the Apple marketing scheme for selling the personal computer. But do you see a lot of the problems with today's progressive conversation, that they're simply recycling the conversations of the 1920s, in a sense, trying to go back to the 20s, when the 2020s, as you know, the economics of the sharing economy, the proletariat has been replaced by a different kind of class. Do we need to think differently here?
We need some new categories. I mean, of course, borrowing from the past, just as folks did in the 1920s, will be of value. But the categories of the 1920s have in some ways run their course. The basic institutions that created mid-century liberalism in the United States, the Industrial Labor Union, the Civil Rights Organization, the Civil Liberties Organization, each one of those is in its own crisis. And there's a real need for some new imagination of the kinds that I think were exercised in the 1920s in the extended world of this foundation.
One of the big characters in your book is Walter White. Was he the first secretary of the NAACP? Certainly a very influential activist on the civil rights front. Do you think that the race issue is as central in the 20s as it is in the 1920s in America?
Oh, for sure. And James Weldon Johnson is the first Black secretary of the NAACP. He's Walter White's predecessor, and he's on the board of directors of the Garland Fund. He's the first director named to the fund. And here's the reason why it was. And Baldwin had experience in St. Louis before and during the war with horrific racial violence. There's a massacre in East St. Louis in 1917 that Roger Baldwin gets to watch from across the river. And that causes him to see that the Great Migration that's bringing Black labor from south to north is one of the central challenges of the 1920s, especially when immigration is cut off east to west. Once European immigration is cut off in 1920 and then again 1924, that Great Migration is the central social project of the age, as Baldwin sees it. And so that puts race right at the front of how American capitalism is going to work.
No, I know that, but my question wasn't about the 20s, it's about the 2020s. Is race as central in whatever questions are, whatever's threatening the American experiment? It clearly was central back then, although, of course, most Black Americans didn't have the right to vote, so they weren't even part of the democratic system.
Well, in all sorts of ways, yes, I think it is. I mean, think of the way in which immigration since 1965, since the 65 Immigration Act, which lifts the gates created in the early 1920s, the American demographics have transformed themselves in all sorts of ways, and the reverberations of that transformation are incredibly apparent in our politics. A politics of Make America Great Again sound a whole lot like a politics of restore the normalcy of late 19th century America, which is the politics of the 1920s Republican Party. So I think race and immigration are central to our politics today, just as they were a century ago, and are things we all need to struggle with and figure out how to move forward with.
What about the issue of marketing? I hadn't actually realized that Edward Bernays, who basically invented PR, the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, both his mother and father were brothers or sisters of Freud. How important was the marketing of the Radical Front? Did Bernays, who doesn't have a great reputation on the American left, was he really important in terms of getting the message out? And did he make stuff up? I mean, Bernays was a brilliant inventor of facts.
Yeah, what he does for the NAACP is design their anti-lynching ad campaign in 1922, which is remarkably successful, even as their legislative campaign in that year is a failure. And Bernays is emblematic of the way in which this generation of American progressives are focused on things that Walter Lippmann helped focus them on: the power of public opinion. I mean, they can't come out of the World War I experience without being focused on the way in which public opinion can be manipulated, shaped, reshaped by the pictures in our heads, as Lippmann so famously put it. And Bernays is, quickly for Madison Avenue and American capitalism, that's his career. Bernays is one of the great students and then practitioners of public opinion shaping.
So should we admire him, even though if he was doing it for conservatives, we'd be outraged?
Well, he does some. I mean, like many people, he does some good things and some bad things. I mean, what I think is striking there is the willingness of this group of progressives to borrow from the most innovative, most cutting edge moves in public opinion shaping and marketing. They have an uncomfortable relationship to American capitalism. They're using the fruits of American capitalism to try to rein in its excesses, and they're intensely aware of the ambiguities. They're worried about being hypocritical all the time, and they're accused of hypocrisy all the time, and they struggle through with all those things.
Would it be fair to say, John, that one perhaps difference between today and the 1920s, there was a lot more trust in politicians? Wilson was once trusted in America, of course. At the end of the First World War undermined his trust. Another of your central figures, Robert Wagner, a U.S. senator. The Senate was much stronger as an institution. Is that a difference between the 1920s and 2020s? Is that Americans no longer, it's not just not trusting their politicians, they don't trust the institutions, they don't trust the very infrastructure of democracy.
Yeah, we're in a low trust moment for sure right now. I mean, I think what we're coming out of is a period of trust built up by the consensus culture of the middle part of the 20th century. I don't want to exaggerate the trust of 1920s America. This is an America of the Ku Klux Klan, of ferocious anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, James Weldon Johnson, great character in this story, he doesn't trust Woodrow Wilson. He gets fired by Woodrow Wilson because he's black. And the entire federal civil service, the entire black federal civil service gets pushed out by Wilson in 1913.
And of course, Wilson's record on race was anything but exemplary, wasn't it?
Exactly, right. And so there's a lot of realism about politics in the 20s. And the project is to create a new infrastructure, an infrastructure of unions, an infrastructure of information that will allow trust to flourish. I think of mid-century institutions of trust as things that came out of this world of distrust.
So rather than being sort of knitted into the very infrastructure of American democracy, the Tocquevillian analysis, you're suggesting something different. Right. Fascinating conversation, John. I have to come back to something you said. I'll probably use it as a title. You said we need a calamity. I'm assuming you're not looking forward to a calamity, though, are you?
No, one doesn't want that. I mean, here I'm resting on the really astonishing book, The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel, historian.
Yeah, who's been on the show several times. He's a Stanford historian of antiquity, isn't he, originally?
Right, and he's got the millennium-long study of how it is that moments of scrambling and equalization happen. And, the Black Death is his paradigm case. Medieval medieval plague.
Wars and civil wars and economic catastrophe. How close are we, John? More and more pieces, I'm sure you see them all the time, about an economic collapse, the AI bubble, obviously civil discord, maybe teetering on civil war. How close is America to what you call a calamity?
Well, I'll lean on your point that history doesn't repeat itself; it rhymes. And so, the pathways by which the future is going to unfold are awfully hard for this historian to say. What I can say about the 20s and the lessons of the 20s is that the efforts of people to make it better haven't been irrelevant. I mean, that's maybe a thin reed. Haven't been irrelevant, but I hold on to it. That matters to me.
Yeah, and of course, you're critical of Fitzgerald's withdrawal from politics. He famously said there are no second acts in American life. But I'm assuming you're faithful not just in a second American act collectively, but a third one. You believe in it, John. You may fear the calamity, but you still remain an optimistic American, that we can save what you call, or what your editor at the New York Times calls, the American experiment. You remain cheerful.
Well, maybe it's characterological, but I grew up here. My kids grow up here. I've got an American flag on the barn in the backyard, and it matters to me. It matters to me a lot. I think there's a lot of good. I see in my neighbors a huge amount of good in this country, and the question is, how can we knit together some institutions that will allow us to channel that instead of the madness of the world that we see all around us.
Now, there you have it. One of the big books of the fall, The Radical Fund. It's out this week by John Fabian Witt, teaches history. And how do you teach both history and law, John? Did you get a special deal at Yale?
Yeah, it's a
I hope they're paying you double.
Sadly not. But they treat me well.
Well, congratulations on the book, John, and I hope you're wrong. I hope there won't be an American calamity.
Let's hope so. Take care.